What if the most dangerous moment in Japan's Pacific War wasn't when things started going wrong, but when everything was going right? Because here's the uncomfortable truth that most people miss. Japan's early victories, as stunning as they were, contained the seeds of their own undoing from the very beginning. On December 7th, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor shocked the world and announced Japan's arrival as the dominant military force in the Pacific. And what followed was nothing short of extraordinary. In the space of just a few months, Japanese forces swept across an enormous stretch of the globe with a speed and ferocity that left Allied commanders scrambling. Hong Kong fell. Malaya fell. The supposedly impregnable fortress of Singapore, the crown jewel of British power in Asia, surrendered in February 1942 in what Winston Churchill called the worst disaster in British military history. The Philippines were overrun. Wake Island, Guam, Rabaul, Rangoon. The Dutch East Indies collapsed. By the spring of 1942, Japan had carved out a resource empire stretching from the borders of India to the Central Pacific, and it had done it faster than almost anyone thought possible. From the outside, this looked like the march of an unstoppable war machine. Allied propaganda scrambled to explain it. Newspapers described Japanese soldiers as superhuman jungle fighters. Military planners who had underestimated Japan just months earlier were now overcorrecting in the other direction, treating the imperial war machine as something almost mythological. The appearance of strategic dominance was complete. But appearances, as history loves to remind us, can be catastrophically misleading. Beneath the surface of those dazzling victories, Japan was operating on a fundamentally flawed strategic foundation, and the cracks were there from day one. Japan in 1941 was a nation of roughly 73 million people, with an industrial economy that was a fraction of America's size. It produced less steel, it built fewer ships, it trained fewer pilots, it manufactured fewer aircraft, and critically, it had almost no domestic oil supply. That last point is crucial because oil was the lifeblood of modern warfare, and Japan's access to it was precarious at best. This is actually why Japan went to war in the first place. The United States had cut off oil exports to Japan in 1941 in response to Japanese aggression in China, and Japan's military planners calculated they had roughly 18 months of fuel reserves. Without new oil sources, the entire imperial military machine would grind to a halt. The conquest of the Dutch East Indies, specifically the oil fields of Borneo and Sumatra, wasn't just a war aim, it was an existential necessity. So Japan went to war to secure resources. But securing those resources required a navy and an air force that ran on the very fuel they were trying to protect. The circular logic was dizzying, and the margin for error was almost non-existent. The war plan Japan's strategists devised was, in their own words, a gamble. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, was deeply skeptical that Japan could win a prolonged war against the United States. His hope was never to defeat America outright. It was to inflict enough early pain that the American public would lose the appetite for a costly Pacific conflict and agree to a negotiated settlement that left Japan's new empire intact. In other words, Japan needed to win so fast and so decisively that the United States wouldn't have time to mobilize its enormous industrial potential. That window was narrow, and Japan's leaders knew it. Making things worse was a fundamental disagreement within Japan's own military establishment about where to strike next. The Imperial Army, fixated on the war in China and wary of the Soviet Union to the north, had little interest in adventures deeper into the Pacific. The Imperial Navy, flush with early success, wanted to expand the defensive perimeter, to push further east and south, to make Japan's new empire harder to attack. These competing visions meant resources were never fully committed to any single strategic direction. Japan was simultaneously trying to consolidate what it had, fight in China, guard against the Soviets, and prepare for the next offensive push. all with an industrial base that couldn't sustain any one of those efforts comfortably, let alone all of them at once. And then there was the problem of geography. Japan had seized an enormous perimeter. Some historians describe it as the largest empire ever created in the shortest amount of time. But size is only an advantage if you can defend it. Japan's new conquests formed a vast, scattered chain of islands and coastlines stretching across millions of square miles of ocean. Defending all of it simultaneously against a recovering and increasingly furious United States was, objectively, impossible. Every island chain that Japan held was another point that could be attacked, another supply line that could be cut, another garrison that could be besieged and starved. By the spring of 1942, Japan's military planners were wrestling with a fundamental strategic dilemma. They had won Phase 1 of their war plan ahead of schedule, but Phase 2, locking in those gains before American power fully mobilized, required at least one more decisive blow. They needed to either eliminate the US carrier fleet, which had survived Pearl Harbor intact, or push their defensive perimeter far enough out that American counterattacks couldn't reach Japan's vital holdings. Ideally, both. The initiative was Japan's, but it was fragile. It depended entirely on keeping the momentum going, on not giving the United States time to breathe, rebuild, and bring its staggering industrial capacity to bear. Every month that passed without that decisive blow made Japan's position worse, not better. What came next would determine everything. The battles of 1942, fought in the Coral Sea, at Midway, and in the grinding hell of Guadalcanal, would reveal whether Japan could convert its early momentum into lasting dominance, or whether those hidden structural weaknesses would finally catch up with it. If you're finding this breakdown valuable, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next part of this story. And drop a comment below. Do you think Japan ever had a realistic path to winning the Pacific War, or was the outcome inevitable from the start? Because the answer is more complicated than most people think. By the spring of 1942, Japan's strategic planners were looking at a map and seeing two problems they needed to solve before American industrial power made itself felt. The first was Port Moresby, a critical Allied base on the southern coast of New Guinea that, if captured, would give Japan a springboard to threaten Australia itself and extend the defensive perimeter southward. The second was Midway, a tiny atoll sitting roughly 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii that, if seized, would push Japan's eastern defensive line close enough to Hawaii to complicate any future American counteroffensive, while simultaneously drawing out the US carrier fleet for a decisive engagement. These weren't random targets, they were calculated moves designed to solve the core strategic problem Japan had identified before the war even started, neutralizing American carrier power before the United States could fully mobilize. What happened instead rewrote the entire course of the war. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 was the first naval battle in history where the opposing fleets never came within sight of each other. Every blow was delivered entirely by carrier-based aircraft. On the surface, the result looked like a rough draw. Japan lost the light carrier Shoho, the United States lost the fleet carrier Lexington, and suffered serious damage to the Yorktown. By the traditional measure of ships sunk, Japan came out slightly ahead. But tactically ambiguous results can carry enormous strategic consequences, and Coral Sea is a perfect example of why. The Japanese invasion force targeting Port Moresby turned back. That was the real outcome, and it mattered enormously. For the first time, Japan's seemingly unstoppable offensive expansion had been physically stopped short of its objective. Australia remained beyond Japan's reach. More critically, the fleet carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, both veterans of the Pearl Harbor strike, were taken out of the equation. Shokaku had been badly damaged. Zuikaku had lost so many of its experienced aircrews that it couldn't be considered fully combat-ready. When Admiral Yamamoto assembled his fleet for the Midway operation just weeks later, those two powerful carriers were unavailable. Which brings us to Midway, and to perhaps the most important word in understanding what happened there: intelligence. American codebreakers, working with extraordinary skill and dogged persistence, had cracked enough of Japan's naval communications to give Admiral Chester Nimitz a priceless gift: advanced knowledge of where Japan intended to strike and roughly when. Nimitz knew the target was Midway, he knew the approximate timing, and he knew the composition of the Japanese striking force. This meant the United States could position its 3 available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, in ambush, waiting for a Japanese fleet that believed it held the element of surprise. On the morning of June 4, 1942, Yamamoto's Kido Butai, the carrier strike force that had devastated Pearl Harbor, launched its attack on Midway's installations while simultaneously preparing to deal with whatever American naval response emerged. What Yamamoto didn't know was that American dive bombers were already in the air. In a matter of minutes that have been analysed and reanalyzed by historians ever since, 3 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were turned into burning wrecks. A 4th, Hiryu, struck back hard enough to cripple the Yorktown before American aircraft found and fatally damaged her as well. By the end of the battle, Japan had lost all 4 carriers that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, along with hundreds of aircraft and, crucially, the irreplaceable veteran aircrews who flew them. The scale of the material loss was catastrophic enough. 4 fleet carriers represented a construction effort that would take years to replace, and Japan's shipyards were already stretched. But the loss of the aircrews cut even deeper. Japan had entered the war with a corps of exceptionally trained naval aviators, pilots who had spent years honing their skills in the skies over China and the Pacific. These were not men who could be quickly replaced. Training a carrier aviator to combat proficiency took years. Japan had no reserve pool of equally experienced pilots waiting in the wings. The veterans who died at Midway took their hard-won expertise with them to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, and no training program Japan could devise would reproduce that institutional knowledge quickly enough to matter. This is the point that gets lost when people reduce Midway to a story about ships. Yes, Japan lost 4 carriers, but what Japan lost at a deeper level was the offensive capability that had made those carriers so dangerous in the first place. The ships were only as powerful as the aircrews flying off their decks. Strip away those veterans, and the carriers Japan eventually rebuilt were, for a significant period, far less effective instruments of war than the ones they replaced. The sword Japan had wielded with such devastating effect was broken, not just shortened, broken. The strategic consequence was immediate and decisive. Before Midway, Japan held the initiative across the Pacific. Its carrier fleet was the most capable strike force in the theatre, and Japanese commanders could choose where and when to apply pressure. After Midway, that freedom of action evaporated almost overnight. Japan was no longer capable of launching the kind of large-scale carrier-based offensive operations that had defined the first 6 months of the war. The perimeter that had seemed so aggressively expandable just weeks earlier now needed to be defended, and Japan suddenly lacked the naval air power to defend it aggressively anywhere it chose. There's an important distinction worth drawing here between tactical shock and strategic consequence. In the immediate aftermath of Midway, Japanese military planners were stunned. But the shock of the loss and the strategic reality of what the loss meant were 2 different things. Even with 4 carriers gone, Japan still held enormous territory. It still had powerful surface fleets. It still had hundreds of thousands of soldiers occupying a vast Pacific empire. The war was far from over. But the nature of the war had fundamentally changed, and that change was permanent. Japan had entered 1942 with the rarest of military advantages, the ability to choose the time, place, and terms of every major engagement. After Midway, that ability was gone. The United States, recovering faster than Japan's planners had ever thought possible, was about to start making those choices instead. And when America made its next move, at a fever-ridden jungle island most people had never heard of called Guadalcanal, Japan would discover just how brutally that shift in momentum could play out. If this kind of deep strategic analysis is something you want more of, make sure you hit like and subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel reach people who love this kind of history. And leave a comment telling me which part of the Pacific War you think deserves more attention than it gets. When American Marines landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, most of them didn't know the name of the island they were fighting for. Japan barely knew it existed as a strategic priority until the moment the United States decided to take it. That's precisely what made the campaign so significant. Guadalcanal wasn't a battle Japan chose. It was a battle Japan was forced into. And being forced into it revealed something that Coral Sea and Midway had only begun to expose. Japan no longer controlled the terms of the war. America did. The immediate trigger was an airstrip. Japan had begun construction of a landing field on Guadalcanal that, once operational, would threaten Allied supply lines running between the United States and Australia. American planners couldn't allow it. So the Marines went in, seized the partially completed airfield, renamed it Henderson Field, and suddenly Japan faced a choice it had no good answer to. Abandon the island and accept a strategic loss that would undermine the entire southern perimeter. Or commit to retaking it and feed men and ships into a grinding campaign they were increasingly ill-equipped to sustain. Japan chose to fight. And that choice accelerated a process of attrition that the numbers were always going to decide in America's favor. The attrition worked on every level simultaneously. In the air, Japan flew missions from Rabaul, hundreds of miles away, pushing its aircraft and pilots to the absolute edge of their operational range. Pilots who were shot down over Guadalcanal were lost. There was no rescue, no recovery. Meanwhile, American pilots who went down near Henderson Field could sometimes walk away from the crash, get patched up, and be back in the cockpit within days. Japan was spending irreplaceable experienced aviators, already badly thinned by Midway, against an American Air Force that was rotating in fresh squadrons, learning from each engagement and getting better every month. Japan's aerial capability over Guadalcanal degraded steadily. America's grew. At sea, the campaign produced some of the most savage naval fighting of the entire war. The waters around Guadalcanal earned the name Iron Bottom Sound, for reasons that are not difficult to understand. The wrecks of ships from both fleets still lie there. Japan's surface navy, particularly its destroyer forces, showed genuine skill and delivered genuine punishment during the nighttime supply runs that American sailors came to call the Tokyo Express. In several engagements, Japanese surface forces defeated their American counterparts outright. But winning tactical engagements and winning a war of attrition are two different things. Every destroyer Japan lost on a supply run was one fewer ship available to protect the fleet. Every ton of supplies lost before reaching the island's starving garrison was a soldier closer to collapse. The United States lost ships too, but it was building replacements at a rate Japan's industrial base could not begin to match. Which is where the deeper arithmetic of the Pacific War becomes impossible to ignore. By 1943, American shipyards were producing more naval tonnage in a month than Japan could manage in several. American aircraft factories were turning out planes in numbers that made Japan's production figures look almost irrelevant by comparison. American training programs were manufacturing qualified pilots faster than Japan's replacement system could keep pace with. And American logistics, The vast, unglamorous infrastructure of supply ships, repair facilities, fuel depots, and transport capacity was supporting a war effort that could sustain losses and keep pushing forward. Japan's logistics were, by contrast, chronically overstretched. The empire it had seized was too large, the sea lanes too long, and the merchant shipping available to keep everything supplied was being steadily consumed by American submarines. Guadalcanal ended in February 1943, with Japan evacuating its surviving troops, the skeletal remnants of a force that had been promised reinforcement and resupply that never arrived in sufficient quantity. The island was gone. But more important than the island was what the campaign had confirmed about the shape of the war going forward. Japan had burned through naval assets, aircraft, and experienced crews it could never recover. The United States had paid a real price too, but it was a price it could absorb. From that point forward, the Pacific War entered a phase that Japan's strategic planners had always dreaded and never found a way to prevent. A war of multiplying Allied offensives, each one demanding a Japanese response, none of them giving Japan the chance to set the terms of battle. MacArthur's forces pushed up through New Guinea. Nimitz's Central Pacific Drive began cracking open island chains Japan had spent years fortifying. The Japanese garrison system, the plan to make every island so costly to take that American resolve would eventually break, ran into the brutal reality that American industrial output could absorb the cost of island hopping, while Japan's ability to reinforce and resupply its garrisons crumbled under submarine warfare and air attack. Japan's military leaders were not without competence. They adapted. They planned counterstrokes. The Eigo operation in 1944 was designed to deliver exactly the kind of decisive carrier battle that Japanese doctrine had always pointed toward. One concentrated engagement that would shatter American naval power and force a negotiated peace. What it produced instead was the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where American pilots and anti-aircraft crews destroyed Japanese carrier aviation so thoroughly that the engagement became known informally as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The weapons Japan had counted on were gone. What remained? The desperate ingenuity of kamikaze tactics, the last gasp surface strike at Leyte Gulf, could inflict pain, could delay the timeline, but could not reverse the fundamental reality that Japan was reacting to an enemy that controlled where, when, and how the war was being fought. That is the core of what happened in the Pacific between 1942 and 1945. Japan's early offensive succeeded in seizing an enormous empire and failed completely in creating the conditions that would allow that empire to be defended. The hidden limits that existed from the very beginning in training pipelines, industrial capacity, logistics, and the inability to absorb losses surfaced one by one as the war ground forward. Coral Sea stopped the southern expansion. Midway broke the offensive instrument that had made expansion possible. Guadalcanal confirmed that Japan could not sustain even a defensive war of attrition against a fully mobilized United States. After that, the question was never whether Japan would lose the strategic initiative it already had. The question was only how long the consequences of losing it would take to fully arrive. The initiative in war belongs to the side that can choose where and how to fight. Japan chose in December 1941. After the summer and fall of 1942, it never chose again. Every battle that followed was fought on terms America set. At times, America selected. In places, America decided to strike. That shift, not any single battle, but the permanent, compounding loss of strategic freedom, is what the Pacific War's turning point actually means. If you found this breakdown worth your time, please hit like and subscribe. It's the best way to support this kind of in-depth history content and help others find it. And drop a comment below. Do you think there was any point after Midway where Japan could have changed the outcome? Or was the result already inevitable? I genuinely love to read what you think.